Good afternoon. It is Tuesday, October 27, 2020. I'd like to call this meeting to order of the Commissioners of the City of Rehoboth Beach virtual special meeting at 3:00 p.m. Welcome, everybody. I'd like to do a roll call of the commissioners. Commissioner Jay Legree.
Here.
Commissioner Susan Gay.
Here.
Commissioner Patrick Gossett.
Here.
Commissioner Richard Byrne.
Here.
Commissioner Edward Chernowski.
Here.
Commissioner Pat Caluzzi.
Here.
I am Mayor Stan Mills. We have a quorum so we can officially conduct business. Also like to recognize that our City Manager Sharon Lynn is in the room with us today. Welcome, everybody. We have only one person signed up from the public to speak, and that is Carol Everhart of the Rehoboth Beach, Dewey Beach Chamber of Commerce. Welcome, Carol, and we'll call on you as appropriate during the meeting. I would like to note that I have not received, or we have not received any correspondence relative to this topic. And I would like to share with you, as I normally do, some of the governor's information that came out of his press briefing of today. He indicated that we are closing in, or the state of Delaware is closing in on 25,000 positive cases in the state. And that currently they're at 93 hospitalizations with 20 critical, but hospital staff feel confident with the procedures in place and capacity throughout the state. Sussex County continues to have a higher amount of positive cases centered in certain areas, and it's the young adult demographic that keeps increasing the rate. Most important thing, as we always say, is to protect yourself and others from the spread of the virus is to wear a face covering and social distancing. I want to remind everybody the City of Rehoboth Beach has not canceled trick-or-treating, but we are forwarding and have forwarded the guidelines from the Department of Public Health that says tells you how to have a safe Halloween season, and you can find more information on cityofrehoboth.com, our city website. Last thing I wanted to share with you is from Dr. Kel Rattay, Director of DPH. She indicates that testing continues to be critical in slowing the spread of COVID-19, and the state is grateful to our community partners. And I wanted to share with you that one of the next pop-up testing locations is Wednesday, October 28th. It is tomorrow from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. right here at City Hall at 229 Rehoboth Avenue, of course. From there, I would like to go into just a reminder of our recent conversations have been directed at outdoor dining and providing alternatives and extra opportunities for outdoor dining during a pandemic. And I just want to reiterate to everybody what pandemic at least means to me, and I think what it means to all of us. During the pandemic, which is what we've been talking about, during the pandemic means emergency conditions per the governor's office and orders, that restaurants' interior seating capacity is reduced or restricted, and that the governor has allowed for restaurants to expand outdoors into public space, remains in effect during the pandemic, as does the alcohol license extensions by the ABCC, all provided by the governor's allowance during pandemic times. Also during a pandemic, policy rules in lieu of having hard, fast, black and white ordinances. And of course, post-pandemic means that the emergency conditions are gone, that restaurant interior seating is restored to 100% capacity, that the governor allowance for outdoor expanded dining is no longer effect, including the alcohol license extensions is no longer in effect. And that's where, if we choose to go that direction, policy rules should likely become hard, fast ordinances. Excuse me. First, I'd like to have Patrick review with us. Patrick, I don't know if you can share that document or not, but I would like us to review the policy that we all approved unanimously earlier this month with respect to barrier removal and outside dining. Patrick, do you have that available? If not, I'll read it.
I have it available. I mean, it was embedded in the agenda. So it's City Policy 1020-01, which we adopted on October 13th. And it's a city policy of the mayor and commissioners for the city of Rehoboth Beach regarding use of public outdoor space through March 31st, 2021, which is the date that currently the ABC guidelines are set to expire, following guidelines of the sidewalk seating on city property. Shall be in effect subject to any emergency order changes for the governor. 1, all orange barriers will be removed no later than November 2nd. After the current barriers are removed, all tables may be placed against the facade of the business. A separation between tables of 8 feet minimum is required. A minimum clear pedestrian path of 60 inches adjacent to the outdoor seating is required. Table and chairs must not block any entrance or ADA accessible areas. If alcohol is served with a valid AB Alcoholic Ward Control Commission permit, a barrier must be in place between the table on sidewalk side of the table to separate the table from the pedestrian walkway. Tents or canopies without sides may be used on city property if approved in advance by the city code enforcement officer and/or the city manager. The code enforcement officer will be responsible for monitoring and ensuring compliance and reporting findings to the mayor and commissioners. And finally, exceptions upon the demonstration of need or hardship may be granted in writing by the city code enforcement officer or the city manager. And we also had a similar policy that outlined the use of outdoor heaters. And it basically covered the same aspect. The specifics is no electric heater or open flame heaters are permitted. Only heaters with propane fuel are permitted, and heaters must be securely placed or weighed in such a way that the heater will not be affected by the winds. Heaters may only be in place during operating hours. Heaters may not block or any entrance or AD accessible areas. A minimum clearance path of 60 inches adjacent to and 36 inches throughout the outdoor seating is required. Heaters must be 60 inches from exits or entrances, and the city code enforcement officer will be responsible for monitoring and assuring compliance and reporting findings to the mayor and commissioners. And finally, exceptions upon the demonstration of need or hardship may be granted in writing by the code enforcement officer or the city manager. And just as a reminder, these do go into effect November 2nd through March 31st, 2021.
Thank you, Patrick, for reviewing those two policies. My intent here was to review them, but also to again highlight the first policy that we all adopted universally, and apologize to everybody because at the last meeting we got a little out of order. There was interest in looking at expanding the existing dining further into the year, and I even led us on that pathway, but after the fact I realized that we unanimously adopted this policy. This is the policy that establishes what happens between November 1st and March 31st with tables and on the sidewalk, etc. Having passed that, we forwarded to the city manager, who is now acting on it. So I intend for that policy to be applicable and enforced. Patrick, I think you worked with Carol and Dennis of Building and Licensing to survey businesses. Would you share in that conversation?
Sure. I think it first, thanks to Dennis and Howard that went out and contacted the 12 restaurants that are currently utilizing barriers and seating outdoors that are still using those. And I believe, Dennis, if you're available, you could share those results with us about their hours of operations and future dining out after November and et cetera. You've had a good conversation with all of these individuals, and I think if you could share that with us, that would be appreciated. give us a little more
Sure,
insight.
Okay, so the bottom line, as far as dining outside after November, it's pretty straightforward. Those 12 restaurants who have barriers, 10 of them do not plan to have outdoor seating when it gets cold out. There are 2 restaurants that are looking at possibly having seating with heaters. But this, of course, is going to be seating up against the building. And for the most part, it's like 6 of the restaurants are going to remain open during these months. 3 of them are unsure. And then there's 3 restaurants that are going to be closed sometime between November and March. So bottom line is there's still a lot of uncertainty out there, and they're all taking it day by day. Any questions?
And you had these conversations with primarily the owners of the establishments?
Correct. This was 10 of the restaurants was with the owner. 2 of them were the managers. However, I previously discussed with the owners on a previous visit, so I still I know that that's what they're feeling. The manager was asking.
And all of the restaurants that you spoke with were aware of the policy and that the barriers were going to be removed, and their seating, they're compliant and happy with what the seating would be for going forward for this period between now and March 31st?
That is correct. That was our main purpose, was to go out and remind them that the barriers were coming down and what was going to be allowed according to the new policy. And there was no pushback whatsoever about keeping the barriers out there. Everybody's comfortable with it.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the time expended on that, but it's very helpful to know those things.
I have a question.
Specific to Dennis's report?
Yes.
Go ahead, Commissioner Caluzzi.
So the ones with the barriers, those barriers are being removed. Are these people considering the idea of the street cafe, or are they considering some other solution?
Okay, so one of the questions that we asked these 12, were they interested in having a street cafe? Not necessarily right away, but sometime in the future. And we had 4 restaurants that were definitely yes answers, positive, looking forward to doing that. A couple of them were adamant about, hey, this is a great idea, we want to do it. The rest of them were like a maybe. They just don't know. There's a lot of factors involved, costs, whatnot. We go back to 100% occupancy post-COVID. Now you're dealing with having to have the added costs of liquor licenses. Are we going over the occupancy level and now required to add more toilets? So there's still a lot of uncertainty on those. But there was no one voiced wanting to do this right away.
Okay, so of the 4 restaurants, are these on the avenue? Where are they physically? Because I think, to me, it makes a difference in terms of understanding space and so forth.
Okay, so let's see, so we've got one over on the corner of First and Baltimore, 2 on Rehoboth Avenue, and 1 on Wilmington.
Okay, thank you.
Don't forget, Ed, I'm going to call on you in a second. Don't forget, Carol Everhart will be online next, giving her report of contact with restaurants. Ed, you have a question specific to Dennis?
I do. Dennis, it sounds like, and thank you for doing it again, but the feedback you received sounds exactly like what you reported to us a month ago. Is that correct? Roughly about the same?
That's roughly about the same, yes.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Ed. Patrick, you want to call on Carol?
Sure. Carol, are you there?
Hear me? Hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
Yes, Carol.
Okay, thank you. Well, we did a count of how many eateries we have in downtown. So there's a total of 119 eateries. 72 are what you'd consider sit-down restaurants. 28 are counter service, fries, snacks, that type of thing. And 19 were the ice cream, candy type of places. We reached out only to the sit-down restaurants. The time was limited, and we thought those were the most likely to want outdoor dining to keep it as it is or have it expanded in the future. We reached 46 of the 72 sit-down restaurants. 3 said no, ever, now, in the future, whatever. 29 said yes, but not necessarily right now. They just like the concept of cafe, outside dining, and seemed content with having it against the facade. And I had, I'm so glad you brought up the motion before, because I had sent that out there and give them the opportunity to link into the city site. So everyone we contacted, for the most part, maybe a few weren't aware, but most of them were very aware that the barriers were going to go away, and that they were going to have the spacing requirements, all of that type of thing. That all being said, I agree with Dennis. We had no pushback, a lot of maybes. It's all about the weather, whether they can do it or not. They love the opportunity. If it's a nice day, they can set their tables out and they stay within the regulations, that they be allowed to continue to do that. I did also ask for, I got some surprises, clear consensus. What did I get clear consensus on? And we were talking now and in the future, so I want to be clear about that. Clear consensus, one size, whatever is decided for the future, was not going to fit all. There's various locations with various sidewalk sides, all sizes, all of that. They clearly said they expected some kind of an associated cost. I asked a few, how is that, you have outside dining in other locations? Yes, I do. How does that work? How do you pay for that? Well, some paid by table, some paid by seating. There was a variety of answers on that. They clearly understood that everything needed to be ADA compliant, that the dining being closest to the facade was best. In other words, closest to their door. I had several say to me, concerns about crossing a sidewalk with food or beverage, that type of thing, which led to a couple restaurants suggesting that if in the future there is space in the parking space, that perhaps the sidewalk could veer out and come back in, as opposed to a placement of some kind of a platform. It was just an interesting idea. I was surprised by it. And they all said, if there is a possibility of having an urban planner or designer when you get to that point, that would be ideal. Everyone appreciated the use of the parking spaces, whether it is a platform or you choose to roll the sidewalk out the way and keep things close to the facade. They agreed with that. They agreed with that, and they really appreciated that. And then I asked for, what were the concerns? Did I have any consistency in the concerns? Well, it limited parking. So whether it was for the customers or their employees, it limited parking, which led to, you might expect this, talk about a parking garage. They would say, well, if we had a parking garage. I said, well, if you have a parking garage, you're going to have to pay for that. They didn't seem to, they seemed to realize that if there's a space for employees and or visitors, that it's going to come with a cost. And logistics and safety. That was definitely and very clearly to me, one of the top concerns, across the board. I don't know if I can offer anything else to that with regard to just the dining, but that's what was able to accomplish.
Thank you, Carol. Being mindful that we're not talking post-pandemic yet,
Mhm.
That'll come up soon enough. I'll give you a timeline later. But does anybody have any questions for Carol?
Yeah, Carol, if I may, could you expand a little bit? You used the phrase logistics and safety. Could you kind of expand on that a little bit as to what you heard or what really that means, if you can? Or
I think it was everything from delivery trucks, if they not stepping on and off of something, you know, a level playing field as you would have it. Um, if there is any type of barricade that is needed, they all knew these barricades were going away because we had clearly sent that out to them. They wanted to make it goes back to the same clean, safe, and friendly. They wanted to make sure whatever's put in place is safe for their customers and for their business and the city.
Very good. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Patrick. With that, I'd like to turn to Sharon. She's had a talk with our insurance carrier, and I'd like her to convey what she learned from that conversation.
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon, commissioners. I did have a brief conversation with our insurance broker, explaining to her that the barriers would be removed next week, November 2nd, and just for the purposes of city liability, what she thought about continuing outdoor dining without the barriers. Ms. Walker, Patty Walker from Williams Insurance, was involved in discussions back in April and May when we were first considering barricades and outdoor dining, and concerns that not only I had, but the city attorney had. So I'll read, just so it's not taken out of context, just a few paragraphs of her correspondence to me. Basically, pursuant to our conversation, this is from Ms. Walker, pursuant to our conversation is my understanding that effective November 2, the city will no longer have the barriers that were in place for the summer that safely allowed the restaurants an extension to outdoor dining due to COVID restrictions. Although the carrier worked to make certain exceptions, the barrier plan was such that it protected pedestrians from vehicles parking and driving down Rehoboth Avenue. The city is now removing the barriers, and therefore the exception for full use of the sidewalk cannot be granted. However, we understand the difficulties that the COVID has presented to many business owners. We feel allowing a single row of outdoor seating for restaurants that abuts the outside of the building would be a consideration. Beyond that extension, we feel it is not in the best interest of the city to allow any further extensions to outdoor dining, as it creates a greater liability to the city if the barriers are not in place. This, in full consideration that all the appropriate CDC guidelines, along with Governor Carney's Delaware regulations, continue to be followed. It is our intent to provide risk management for the city's exposures and consideration of balance for the city's restaurants and visitors during this very difficult year. So that was her correspondence to me late yesterday, and I wanted to pass that information along, obviously, at this meeting where it's pertinent for you to hear it.
Thank you, Sharon. And it is very pertinent, and it goes back to helping validate the original policy that we adopted on 10/13/2020, having to do with removal of the barriers, pushing the tables only, placing them up against the facade of the business, et cetera, and establishing that timeline of November 1st or 2nd through March 31st. So again, I just want to reaffirm this policy that we unanimously adopted, and we'll keep that in effect. Are there any questions for Sharon on that bit of information?
so Sharon,
If
just to
not,
be
I'd like to move on. So what happens starting April 1st? We're talking about everything coming to a halt, if you will, through March 31st, except for tables placed up against the facade of stores. Then what happens starting April 1st? Well, if the pandemic is over, we're going to broach that starting November 10th and have a conversation starting then to introduce post-pandemic outdoor dining. But if we are still in a pandemic as of 3/31 and the governor extends the emergency orders past March 31st, and this goes into April, May, June, through part of the summer, then what happens? And that's what I wanted to offer a different approach, I guess, to this. And I ask for your consideration of this path forward beyond 3/31. Provided we are still in the pandemic. After 3/31, resume the current program of allowing outside dining on the sidewalks with pedestrian pathways in the parking areas, exactly as was done late this summer, but establish additional rules such as insurance requirements, et cetera, that were part of previous conversations that Patrick was working on. I'd like you to consider that, and I'd also like to say that because of actually reinforced by what we heard from Dennis today and Carol Everhart, and because of seemingly lack of interest in overall in street cafes, the costs, having to traverse public sideways with trays of beverages or foods being cited as challenges, that I recommend we consider discontinuing the talks on and eliminating street cafes as an option. So those are two offers, and that I believe the city manager and chief, if they want to voice any opinions on those, I believe we're in concurrence with those ideas. So those are, again, for continued pandemic. The businesses like the program they have. I don't particularly like it. I'd like to reclaim the sidewalk, but it worked, and it's only during the pandemic. And then we would start conversation November 10th on finalizing any rules for that, but also introduce the post-pandemic dining options discussion. I'll open it up for discussion. Commissioner Srnowski, you have your hand up.
Yeah, Mayor, this is quite shocking considering we spent weeks discussing street cafes, and there was consensus being built. And you say that there's lack of interest by the businesses. That is not true. There's been a lack of commitment by businesses for various reasons: cost, weather, heaters, many different reasons. So it's disingenuous to say there's lack of commit or interest, because there is. And there's interest by the consumers, by our residents, by our visitors to sit and eat outside. And we know by every scientist in the world that it's safer to eat outside.
Ed, let me interrupt you a minute. I apologize, but we're not talking about eliminating. None of my ideas talk about eliminating dining, so that should not be part of the conversation. What we are is giving them the current opportunity they have now and extending it during the pandemic. So everyone can certainly give their opinion, and that's what I'd like to hear.
That's all I have.
So are you
Go
saying?
ahead, Ed.
All I have.
Keeping the barriers?
Commissioner Calusi.
Are you saying keeping the barriers? Is that what you're saying at this point?
Well, no, not keeping the barriers now, but bringing them back. If they want to go that route, bringing them back.
So
it's just an option. Again, some of the businesses say they like what they have. You heard Carol say that like the businesses or restaurants like having their dining area abutting their front facade so they don't have to cross sidewalks, etc. And again, this is not post-pandemic world. This is continued post-pandemic.
Okay, I
So is that-
understand, but here's what I want to talk about. So, yes, everyone agrees that the barriers are not particularly attractive. Um, but to take them away, which I think is, I guess, perhaps okay, or maybe the business has to invest in, or okay, I'm not sure which way to go with this, but there are other options. They have very large planters that are concrete that you could fill with soil and put in, put something in there that would probably be about as, satisfactory of a barrier as the current red things that we have. So that could be an option, and I think it's worth discussion if we want to. If we do it, I agree with Commissioner Szymanski that we have a lot of interest in it. It's just not a lot of ability to make the commitment at this point. However, I suspect this makes it a lot easier for businesses if they're going to perhaps have their own barriers, if you will, to replace the red barriers, unless the city decides to do something. But from my point of view, if you want it to look attractive, then perhaps the businesses might want to invest in some sort of concrete planters or something else like that that would be just as safe as the red barrier. So that's my perspective on this.
Thank you, Commissioner Cluzy. I appreciate your input. I really see the question, though, as which dining opportunities do we want to provide? In addition to the single row of tables up against the building, do we want to go back to the program that we used this summer, which is tried and true, a lot of the businesses like that? Or do we want to eliminate that and continue and perfect the street cafe concept? We've got Commissioner Byrne and then Commissioner Gay.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate your clarification the last couple of minutes here, because that was part of my question. My opinion, and you asked us for our opinions, I would much prefer to see that we continue to have a little more discussion on how the street cafes could operate, what some of the parameters would be, and then we put in the hands of the city manager and the city team to work with the restaurants that have an interest when they're willing to make a commitment. I agree with Edward that I don't think there's a lack of interest. There is a lack of commitment because there's so many variables. I think until they know at least some variables that we can control, and that is the parameters of what a street cafe is and what it isn't, that we will see more interest. Certainly, street cafes are much more attractive. I think will bring in more business. They can be done, obviously, in ways that are safe, in the way that Carol talked about it, the way that we have spent hours now talking about over the last several weeks. So I'd like to see us get back to talking about street cafes as a preference to bringing the barriers back during the season. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Gay.
Yeah, well, first of all, I really appreciate having the feedback from both Dennis and from Carol in talking to the restaurants. And it's true, we've spent some time talking about this, but I'm just glad to have the feedback now so that we don't go down a path that isn't desired. And frankly, it doesn't sound like it's desired by the restaurants, or feasible. Maybe that's the other way I should say it. It doesn't sound like it's really, most of them consider it to be very feasible. But the insurance question, I think, is a biggie, because if that's an issue, if the insurance company basically says, no, that the city, we will not cover the city on liability for street cafes, I think maybe that's what I heard, that, and we can't transfer that liability risk to the restaurants, then that may be a showstopper right there. But one question I had about logistics in terms of what we do starting April 1, and you mentioned bringing the barriers back if we were still in the pandemic. I'm assuming this is any phase. Like, for instance, if we're in I don't remember what phase 3 was supposed to be, for instance, and whether that was restaurants going back to 100% or whether it was 75 or what. But I guess I'm assuming that even if we're still in whatever transition period back to whatever normal is going to be, that's what that we would have these parameters in place, basically, as long as the governor has some provision for it. Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Correct.
Then I think it would be, I mean, it's tried and true. It's what everybody knows. I think Pat's idea about the concrete barriers, letting the restaurants sort of bring in maybe something aesthetically is an interesting concept. My only concern, aesthetically, it certainly, would look better than the orange barriers, but I believe that anything we do after April, I have to believe that anything we do then is really temporary. So I don't know to what extent, the restaurants would want to bring in, even concrete and all, if they weren't going to use it for very long. That would be my only concern, whereas the barriers can kind of come and go without much trouble. That's all I have.
Thank you. Commissioner Calusi, Legree, and Byrne?
Yes.
Commissioner Calusi?
So what I thought I heard from Carol Everhart is the restaurants were concerned about crossing the sidewalk to deliver food to tables and street cafes. I thought I heard that, and maybe she could clarify that. But again, post-pandemic, I think where we may be talking about a streetscape for the streets that for people who want to have outdoor dining, which will probably be the majority of the restaurants, will want that. So I think we have to start thinking about what does that really mean for the city as far as post-pandemic. But if we can think of a pathway that moves some of these restaurants, let's say we kind of stay with what we have right now, okay, and we continue to not necessarily have the red barricades, but use something different. If maybe as a city, there's something that we would think about purchasing that could be used in the future for something else. I mean, I don't know, I haven't thought it through, but we certainly don't want to, have anyone waste money on barriers that aren't going to be somewhat useful in the future. So I guess what I'm asking at this moment is for Carol to please clarify about the businesses and the delivering food across the sidewalk, whether that's really a consideration or not. If it's really not, then maybe we should continue to talk about street cafes. But if it's consideration, maybe that's just something we won't want to do. And of course, Commissioner Gay brought up the whole idea about whether or not we'll be insured, which I think is critical.
Before I call on Carol, I just want to remind everybody that we're not talking post-pandemic until November 10th, all right? Carol, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Mayor. All I can tell you is based on the responses that I received for now and through the end of this state of emergency, they are basically very pleased and happy to be able to use their facades. The weather's uncertain, the time of year's uncertain, they're uncertain. So it allows them to operate when they can by using the facades without extra expense, without extra work on their part at this point. And as they went into the future, as when they talked about, well, if you do move into the future and you're going to do something permanent, then those questions about crossing sidewalks and all of those other issues come into play.
Thank you, Carol. Commissioner Legree? Unmute yourself.
Got it. Sounds like Dennis and Carol have boots on the ground and have been finding out things that we really needed to know. And my original worries about logistics and cost seem to be valid. So I'm with, and insurance is something else. I'm with Commissioner Gay. I think we need to press on. Thank you. Press on without talking anymore about street cafes until the time comes.
Thank you, Commissioner Legree. Commissioner Byrne, and then Commissioner Gossett.
Yeah, let's clarify the issue around insurance. Commissioner Gay said one thing, and I heard something else. I thought I heard city manager say that the insurance company didn't recommend, as opposed to would not insure. I mean, I would expect an insurance person to not recommend it. That's what they make money off of, is to totally limit all risk. But so many municipalities have street cafes and other similar options, that there must be many insurance companies that find a way to provide coverage for this.
Commissioner Byrne, if I may attempt to clarify, my question that I posed to Ms. Walker was merely the barriers are being removed and the continuation of sidewalk dining was being considered, because that's, again, some of the conversation from last week. So her response was just that, based on sidewalk seating like we had this past summer and currently have. We did not get into any other issue of next summer, if the pandemic is lifted, we're back to phase 3, and what about if the commissioners decide to permit street cafes in the parking spaces. So we didn't get into any of that. Her response was basically just what I said, seating to continue on the sidewalks like we have now. She did say that she feels it is not in the best interest of the city to allow any further extensions to outdoor dining, as it creates a greater liability to the city if the barriers are not in place. And that was my question.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for the clarification. So, and then just to clarify my own thoughts about street cafes, that I would like to see us continue in that direction, but my interest would be that we provide that option in early November, that we not hold off to have it as an option next spring.
I think,
To provide street cafes in early November? Was that your recommendation?
Yes.
So next week to have street cafes?
If a restaurant is interested, I would support that. Given the parameters that we've been talking about, that Patrick presented to us a week or so ago, that we had a lot of conversation about, and that your city team then could, I think, figure out how to translate that into options for restaurants that might want to go that direction.
Well, the thing is, Commissioner, that's why I started off the meeting with reiteration of the policy that we unanimously adopted. It says remove the barriers. It essentially says there's no street cafes. It's not that direct, but it says all the dining has to be pushed up against the facade of the building. So now your desire kind of contravenes the policy. So which is it going to be?
No, no. I think that's a false choice, Mayor. Yes, we've approved these items. I support this. I think we were unanimous in supporting this. We've spent at least one meeting, if not a couple. We've spent hours talking about, okay, so we've approved that. Now, do we want to provide an additional option of street cafes? So it's not a choice of throwing out this that we've already approved. It would be in addition to this. And I understand we've not approved street cafes. That yet would be another.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Right,
thank you.
gotcha. Thank you.
Just a
Commissioner Gossett?
Yeah, just a comment, Commissioner Burns. I think the aspect is, if I remember from the reports, that there didn't seem to be any interest in immediacy of a street cafe. I think, if Dennis, you can remind me, there was only 2 of the 12 that were even interested in having outside dining at all after November, and all of those were aspects of keeping, were happy with what they had currently. Is that correct, if I remember?
Yes, that is correct.
And I think the question that I've heard come up around here is that, whether there's current interest or not current interest in a street cafe, what the real question is the lack of information about street cafes. So I think that the aspect of taking the model that we have used this summer, and the restaurants are familiar with and seem to be accepting of street cafe, or rather sidewalk cafes with barriers in the street for pedestrian ways, to implement that back beginning April 1st, with whatever tweaks, if there were, to improve it, both on the city side and the restaurant side, is the way to go. It's something that is in place, people are familiar with, they're accepting of. Our guests are excited about eating on the sidewalks, this type of thing. So I guess the old phrase, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That reset, that people are happy with this. So instead of creating something additional and new, let's stick with what we have. And again, this is just during the pandemic issue, and then look at alternatives beyond or post-pandemic. But if people are used to it and familiar with it, both again on the restaurant side and the city side, I think to continue with that. Now, there have been some issues raised, I think, that I kind of gleaned from the report, was that one size does not fit all, and I think we've all agreed to that. And the question that people aren't willing to commit is that because of the costs involved. Well, if we continue the program that we had this summer to next summer, the restaurants are familiar with the cost. They know what the investment is, whether it's tables and chairs, it's not building a platform or not renting a parking space or something of that nature. So I won't say they're fixed costs, but they are costs that they are familiar with and have dealt with for one season already. So they could then understand what they'd have to commit for the next season. And there was a comment I think I heard about loss of parking spaces, and that's a two-way street. The restaurants, parking is a very valuable commodity in Rehoboth, not only for restaurants to have parking in front of their restaurants, but also the revenue that we realize it for the city. So again, I think that's a double-edged sword, but it was a concern raised by the restaurants, if I remember hearing that from Carol. And on our side, the loss of parking revenue, which I think was substantial this year. So that's something to be considered going forward. And then something that's, I think I won't say left at the wayside, but the safety issues. I know the city manager was rather concerned with the safety issues and barriers and railings and what have you. And I think, the chief also had strong concerns about that when the initial discussion of this began. So I don't know if city manager or chief, if you have any further thoughts or reminders about those concerns early on.
Yes, so I'll just turn it over to the chief in a few minutes. But Commissioner Gossett, you did a lot of work before it even came to the commissioners to talk about parklets, then street cafes. So, of course, that was thought and bantied about, if you will, amongst the staff after your meetings with all the commissioners seated here. I just want to go back to the fact that we created the outdoor dining to help the businesses, mainly because they were suffering, and I'll use that word, because they had a lack of 100% capacity inside. So we spoke to them individually and worked with them to have outdoor seating on the sidewalk. Of course, I had to involve the insurance company at that point, And based on their responses at that time, we went ahead and did that. And Ms. Walker points that out in her response due to the COVID restrictions. So again, we bantied that about amongst the staff, and you know, the city really isn't laid out to have outdoor dining in with streetscape and within the parking lots. So, and there's no way, I don't think, unless, you know, we can put our heads together and come up with a plan, have safe access, and we cannot close the street, which most cities do. So we've researched that, we've looked into it, and most municipalities do close the streets when they have any kind of outdoor dining in close proximity to traffic. We considered the fact that there would be a platform. The platform would be raised at least 6, maybe 10 inches in some cases above, right next to where the traffic lane is, a travel lane for vehicular traffic. Summertime, it's very crowded here. The traffic's backed up at any time on both sides of Rehoboth Avenue. There are exhaust fumes, there's loud music from vehicles, radios playing, and the close proximity to people seated in the parking spaces just is not safe. And I'll just, you know, add to that, again, that has not been fully vetted, so we don't know what that would look like. But I think what I'm hearing from the businesses, and Ms. Everhart can confirm that, as she has, that, you know, they don't know, they don't have an appropriate response to businesses until the commissioners set the parameters there. But the staff response is that the city was never set up for this. Vehicular pedestrian traffic is very, very difficult when we're back into normal circumstances on any given summer day. And I'll turn it over to Chief Banks.
Good afternoon, Mayor, Commissioners. Thank you, Sharon. I think Sharon said it well and gave most of the information. I just did want to go back to say that we have been working with DelDOT, and DelDOT's been asked to work with municipalities to expand any outdoor seating if they think it's deemed dangerous. Now, where they've been working at is still having barricades, and that's where I get concerned when we are taking barricades away and we still having tables out in the middle and close to the curb, not just against the facade. As far as the cafes, as Sharon said, at most of it, we need something, I'll use the word substantial, and with railings so people don't fall off into traffic, a type of wheelchair or some baby stroller or anything back. So we just need to make sure it's up so it's, people would naturally slow down when they're coming up to that, as well as that is safety for the people that is sitting on there, they don't go out into the roadway. So we definitely need to make sure if we go that direction and that it's substantial. Again, most of the research I've done is they close the streets. That's definitely not in all cases, but that's the majority. I keep thinking of Rehoboth Avenue as a dead-end street or a cul-de-sac per se, because at the end, everybody's kind of slowing way down and sitting still with cars idling, like I said, fumes and radios or whatever the case may be when you have something, a vehicle right on top of what would be a cafe. So we do have concerns as far as the police department and public safety, just making sure that it would all work and that it's safe. And we probably would recommend more against the facade, definitely without any barricades.
Well, look, obviously I threw a wrench in here. The question I threw out is, do we continue with sidewalk cafes as has been done before? Or do we continue or discontinue with street cafes, or do we offer both options? And Chief and Sharon, do you have any direct preferences?
for these,
For continued during the pandemic, next spring when it starts to get warmer and we are contemplating expanding outdoor dining again, which route to go? Continue with the street cafes, continue with the sidewalk cafes, or give the restaurants an option of both?
so I definitely, would think that, we should highly consider, if not assure the businesses, the restaurants, that we would do the same thing as we did this past year. We would work with them individually. There may be more so. I know, we have some restaurants that are in the queue right now waiting to open and some vacant spots. And we would work with them on a regular basis to attain what we had this past summer, with outdoor seating on the sidewalk. We would get the barriers back. I think maybe there's a cost sharing with the barriers. If the businesses wanted to pay for them, the city would forgo the parking revenue that would be lost. But if the pandemic continues and restaurants are below 100% capacity, I absolutely think that we should consider giving them the same opportunities as they had this past year. I think the insurance company, the insurance carrier would be fine with that, and any other discussion post-pandemic, would have to take place in the off-season. We don't know. We don't know when we'll go back to normal.
And from a public safety standpoint, I would echo the city manager's comments and go back to what we did this past year.
Okay. I'd like to go back to Carol and offer her the same opportunity to comment on a path forward, whether we continue with street cafes, or go back to the sidewalk cafes as was done last year. Do you want to offer any comment, Carol?
Well, again, for now, offering the facade was generally agreed across the board. If at the end of March 31, we are continuing with less than 100% capacity in the restaurants, I know that they would like to see an opportunity to continue to do the type of business they did this year. However, it was hit and miss, I would put it. It wasn't 100% one way or the other as to the barricade situation. I know they like the cafe type thing. They like being outside on the sidewalk. Any additional space, of course, they're going to welcome if there's not if it's affordable to them type of thing. But right now, the facades, they seem happy with that till we get to March 31st. So I don't envy you.
Thank you, Carol, very much. Commissioner Gay and then Commissioner Byrne.
First of all, I'm really glad that the city manager and chief addressed the whole issue of how, because I think we lose sight of that sometimes, of how we're laid out, and how some of these concepts are really give us a lot of challenges. Because I know over the last few months, not only have I seen, we've been sent photos from other cities. I've seen photos of other cities and research I've done. I've actually been to some other places and seen how their outside settings are done, and everybody's different. I mean, some places have very wide sidewalks, so it's much easier. Some, as several mentioned, the chief mentioned, they close the streets, because when you have a whole block that's nothing but restaurants, it's easy to just close the streets if that's not a main drag. Some of them have tables just by the facades if they have small sidewalks like we do. Some of them go into the street, but they don't, or they have the street cafes, but they don't have the crowds we have in the same amount of space we have. And I just think that our uniqueness, is that both the size of the city, the 1 square mile, and obviously even smaller than that in the central business district, and the crowds of people that come here do give us some limitations. So I think we have to be mindful of that. I don't know anyway even of the other places I've seen, I don't know that any two of them are alike either, because every place has to make the guidelines whatever works for them. I also don't see other coastal communities here doing it. So I feel like we're ahead of the game in that we have done this summer and that we want to continue doing it. I think it's a real plus for Rehoboth. But I do want to also not lose sight of the suggestion. I don't know if it came up when something Carol was saying, but I think Pat also mentioned it, bringing an urban planner in for future developments, especially if we're going to be redeveloping Baltimore and Wilmington streetscape, is critically important, because it's very hard to retrofit. But if you have if you're looking at it going forward, and that's why I'm saying the uniqueness and all, we're retrofitting. Anything we do now is retrofitting. If we can look ahead and put the outdoor aspect into future plans, then I think that's a good thing to do too.
Thank you, Susan. Commissioner Byrne?
Yeah, thank you, everyone. I've heard lots of the challenges and lots of the limitations in moving ahead toward parklets or street cafes, Mayor. So there certainly is not the will to go in that direction right now. That's very clear. So I don't think we should spend any more time debating that. So I'm back to where you were, I guess, a half hour ago, but I think we needed to go through this exercise. There's not the will to do it. And there are many challenges and many limitations that have been pointed out by a couple of the commissioners, city manager, our chief, and those are all serious considerations, no doubt. So what I would like to see us do then is to confirm that we will move in the springtime to, assuming the pandemic emergency continues past March 31, to then continue what we have done for this season. I think that we need to figure out how do we have barriers that are much more beautiful than the red barriers we've had. They're not attractive. That looks like a street maintenance project that doesn't end. Are they safe? Yes. Are they effective in doing the logistical things with pedestrians and so on? Yes. But they're not attractive. Our city is so beautiful in so many ways. And we need to then, in the next several months, figure out how do we find barriers that are beautiful, that are attractive, that, well, they go along with the rest of our city. And I think that, I know we're working on this March 31st date. I understand that totally. But I think that our restaurants are going to want to be able to say on March 1, we give them these parameters and they're ready to go if the weather is cooperative. So thank you all for indulging my continued conversation around this.
No, I agree. We keep conversation moving so that we can finalize our policy before the end of the year, I would hope. Patrick?
Yeah, I agree. I think that what have heard is that, there's some challenges with street cafes and people are interested in them, but they are also, questioning the cost and expense that they would have. So that's why I go back to the discussion to really what we had in place this past season that worked. The restaurants and the owners know what it was. They know what to expect. The city knows how to implement it and kind of what the challenges were, if you will, that happened this season, and can adjust and tweak the policy or design a policy that it's a little more clear, or just give the flexibility to the building inspector and code enforcement officer and the city manager to work through those things. But the policy, the model worked. The restaurants seemed to be happy with it. Certainly our visitors were happy with it. We heard very good things about that. So just taking that policy, tweaking it a slight bit, and that would be at the direction of the city manager and her staff, coming back to say, this is what we're going to do. And I think we would be able to have that in place by November, or at the latest, the first part of January, so that restaurants know exactly what to expect for next season. That, again, being said for during the pandemic, because once the pandemic is lifted, there are other kinds of issues that come into play that, are waived because of the governor's executive order being ABCC and health department and fire department and all that. And those are very big issues that we don't necessarily have total control over. So I think those just kind of move down the line a little bit to talk about, but let us give the restaurants the guidance that they need now to prepare for next season so that they can do some planning.
Well, and thank you, Patrick. And so how I see our future is that we would be off November 3rd because Election Day, that's the next Tuesday. Our next meetings after that could be November 10th and 17th. I would say November 17th, Patrick, you help us tweak the policy for continued ongoing sidewalk cafes, as was done this last year, with a few tweaking, by example, adding insurance requirements or something. And then after that, during the same meeting, I think we might be able to do an introductory discussion of permanent outdoor dining scenarios. Does that sound all right?
Yeah, I'd be happy to take that on and prepare for that information for the November 17th meeting.
I'm proud of what we're doing. Yeah, maybe we lost a little time, but we've been very methodical. We're looking at different ideas. I think we're way ahead of the game, so that by January or so, we're liable to have our ideas set on paper, so that these restaurants can decide what to do. Of course, it's all dependent upon the endurance of this COVID-19 thing. So, is there any other comment from the public? Carol, one last time.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm proud of you too. You've done a lot and the restaurants really do appreciate it. And so does the business community. And so does your Chamber of Commerce. So thank you. It's a big job.
Thank you, Carol. And are there any further comments? If not, then I'm ready to adjourn. One last chance. All right, thank you very much. This meeting's adjourned.